Hmm? It's your husband's, you know, at least spiritually. That's what she whispered. Right there, at her own baby shower. Her lip curled like she'd won something. I didn't flinch. I poured her another cup of tea, vanilla chamomile. Same brand her mother hated. The baby balloon bobbed behind her head, pink and silver. Too cheerful for something so cruel. Janelle always had that edge in her smile. But today it cut. I sat there, hands steady, eyes soft. Not because I was calm, because I was ready. Let them sip punch. Let them compliment the tiny buttercream shoes on the cake. I'd spent 2 weeks on that cake. 3 tiers, pale pink fondant, a sugar cradle on top. Every piddle hand, piped by someone she barely tolerated. Peter didn't notice. He never does when work piles up. He thinks absence is kindness. That some things just solve themselves. But sons don't always see what mothers do. Especially not the way Janelle looked at Rick last fall. Rick, who used to fix our gutters. Who once danced with me at Peter's graduation party. I watched her hands then. The way she smoothed her blouse when Rick spoke. Too careful, too polished. Still, I held my tongue. Even when I found my late husband's wedding cuff tucked in her drawer. That cuff was buried with him. Or so I thought. I told myself I was tired. That grief made shadows where none existed. But shadows move when the light shifts. Last month, I borrowed her coffee cup. Swabbed the rim with a cotton pad I'd hidden in my coat. I didn't need Rick's permission. I still had his old brush from when he stayed during the roof leak. And when the lab results came back, I smiled. The baby wasn't Peter's. It wasn't Rick's either. And it sure as hell wasn't my husband's. The father's name sat there, black ink on white paper. George Maddox. My neighbor. She thought I hadn't noticed the late walks. The porch giggles. The second mug she always brought out. Janelle never was subtle. Just practiced. I folded the results back into the manila envelope. Tucked it inside my purse, zip clean, quiet. And I waited. Today, as she smirked, I poured tea. I placed a lemon slice on the rim. Because details matter, she leaned in. I hope this baby has his eyes. I didn't ask whose. She wanted me to react. She fed on it, like a crow picking at pride. Instead, I smiled. Oh, darling, I said. I'm sure the baby will be full of surprises. Her brow twitched. That flicker. That instant of doubt. Let her think I was rattled. Let her play queen for 1 more hour. The cake knife still rested in my hand. Still warm from her touch. Still sharp. The guests clapped as Peter stood to toast. His voice trembled with joy. Thank you, everyone. And Mom, thank you for making today perfect. I nodded. But my eyes stayed on Janelle. She toasted with apple cider. I toasted with the truth tucked in my purse. And when the gifts were done, when the napkins were stained with frosting, I stood. I think someone forgot this, I said, lifting the envelope. The room turned, and Janelle. She finally lost that smile. People say grief fades. It doesn't. It folds itself into quieter corners of your life, like flour dust in the corners of a kitchen drawer. I still smell him sometimes. Early morning, when the lake fog crawls in. When the coffee hasn't started yet, and the floorboards creak under bare feet. That's when Henry lingers. 41 years married. 2 of them rough, 39 golden. We built the bakery from scratch. Sharpe's breads and treats. A corner lot with a red awning, tucked behind the library. He made the rye. I piped the buttercream. Every Thursday, he'd bring home orange tulips. And every Friday, he'd fall asleep watching Jeopardy, mouth open. Then came the stroke. Fast. Final. I shut the bakery 3 weeks later. Folks brought casseroles. Hugged me too long. But by the 2nd month, it was just me and the lake. And Peter, of course. He was 30 then. Working double shifts at the auto shop downtown. Still single, still full of fix-it plans. He moved back in for 6 months after the funeral, slept on the pull-out couch, drank too much root beer, kept the kitchen noisy. He said, "You shouldn't be alone." But the truth was, I wasn't. Grief is company. Quiet, demanding. And it remembers everything. I stitched memory into everything I did, kept the flour bins full. Hung Henry's apron like it still waited for him. Peter eventually moved out again. Bought a fixer-upper across town. He came every Sunday for pot roast. Those Sundays, they saved me. It was one of those Sundays, 4 years later, when he said, "I met someone." He said it with the dumbest grin, the kind that turns men into fools. "She's smart, Mom, sharp, in marketing, Janelle." The name tasted like artificial sweetener. But I smiled. I always do. She came for dinner a month later. Brought a lavender candle and a peach pie from the grocery store. "Didn't want to compete with you," she said, laughing. I appreciated the gesture. But there's something about a woman who brings pie to a baker's house. Something strategic. Janelle was beautiful. Blonde in that icy, pin straight way. Her voice smooth. Her compliments crisp. Peter adored her, and that was enough for a while. They married the next spring. No big ceremony, just courthouse vows and lunch at Main Street Cafe. She wore cream. I wore navy. I made the cake, chocolate with raspberry buttercream. 2-tier, modest, beautiful. She never ate a slice. Still, I tried. I offered to help decorate their guest room. Dropped off fresh bread on Fridays. Wrote birthday cards with glittered stickers. Once, I brought her my old family recipe book, handwritten, grease-stained, full of notes. She thanked me. Then handed it to Peter later that week, saying, "Your mom wants us to cook more." Isn't that sweet? That word, sweet, how she said it, always curled at the end, like the blade of a knife. By the second year, the visits thinned. Peter called less. "Work," he said. Janelle's clients needed weekends. I told myself it was normal. Sons marry. Priorities shift. But when Peter stopped dropping by on my birthday, that's when the quiet started to hurt. The cake I made for myself that year, it sat untouched until Monday. Still, I baked. Still, I smiled. Because being a mother means not making your children feel guilty. It means holding silence like tea in a fine china cup. Then, last fall, Rick came to fix the porch light. He was an old friend of Henry's. Used to fish together in the bay. He still smelled like cedar and menthol. Still hummed old Elvis songs when he worked. Janelle happened to stop by. Said she wanted to borrow Peter's pressure cooker. But she stayed longer than needed, lingered by the railing where Rick knelt. Touched her hair, smiled slow. It meant nothing, I told myself. Rick was 65. Widower. Called me, out of habit. Still, her eyes lingered too long, and his laugh, it wasn't his usual one. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I couldn't unsee. I opened my bottom drawer. Pulled out the cuff Henry wore on our last anniversary. And remembered. He had wanted to be buried with it. But the undertaker had called me 2 days before the service. "Do you want to leave the jewelry on?" I'd said no. And now it was gone from my jewelry box. I checked twice. 3 times. Under the velvet pouch. Behind the ribbon, tied letters. Gone. And I knew where I'd seen something similar. In Janelle's dresser tray, 3 weeks prior, when she asked to borrow hand lotion. She left her purse open, a flash of gold engraved with Airy Fletch 1974. I didn't ask. Mothers don't accuse. We observe. But a seed had been planted. And some seeds grow fast. Especially in silence. Especially in women like me. It started with the napkins. Last Thanksgiving, I offered to bring cloth ones. Cream linen, embroidered edges. Wedding gift from my Aunt Ruth. I'd kept them spotless for 40 years. "Oh, that's sweet," Janelle said. "But we're going for modern this year. Paper's easier. Paper, easier. Like I was a relic." I smiled. Of course, she used words like precious and sweet, like seasoning. A little here, a little there. And never too much, but always enough to let you know where you stood. Peter didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. He was busy carving the turkey, laughing with her brothers about tailgates and tools. I brought pumpkin rolls. No one touched them. Janelle had made cheesecake, store-bought crust, topped with crushed peppermint bark. People raved. "That's creative, honey," I said. She nodded. Pinterest. I poured coffee, sat in the corner, watched the way she walked the room. Not like a guest, not like a daughter-in-law, like a hostess. Like she'd claimed every inch of the house. Peter included. She rearranged the spice rack I gave them, said it was too busy. moved the baby photos of Peter to a lower shelf, told guests, "Oh, that's just some of his mom's old stuff. Old stuff." I kept quiet, because silence holds better than confrontation, until it doesn't. 2 weeks later, I dropped by unannounced. Peter was at work. Janelle was home, barefoot, in leggings, eating a yogurt on the couch. "Oh, Evelyn," she blinked. "Did we have something planned?" "No, dear," I said. "Just bringing over the table runner you asked about." She waved toward the dining room. "Leave it there." "Sorry, I'm in the middle of editing this client deck." I walked past her, holding my breath against the citrus candle she always lit. Sharp. Synthetic, not like Henry's pipe tobacco. Not like cinnamon and vanilla. I set the runner down. Adjusted it once. Then paused. Her phone buzzed. She turned away. Something about engagement analytics. And that's when I saw it. Her purse, half open on the sideboard. A gold chain peeking out. Not just any gold chain. A flat, vintage link, like sunlight frozen in motion. My breath stopped. That necklace. I knew it. Henry gave it to me on our 10th anniversary. It had a tiny emerald set in the clasp. His birthstone. I hadn't seen it in years. I thought I lost it after his funeral. My fingers twitched. I turned toward Janelle. She was laughing at something on her laptop. I moved slowly. 3 steps. Quiet. Slipped the chain from the purse. The emerald winked at me. There was no mistake. I held it for 2 heartbeats. Maybe 3. Then placed it back exactly where I'd found it. Janelle never noticed. On the drive home, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I parked in front of the lake and sat there until the sun slipped low. Waves tapping the shore like soft accusations. Why would she have it? Where did she even find it? The last time I wore that necklace was Christmas, maybe 4 years ago. Henry had passed. Peter came over with a tree, small and crooked. Janelle stayed home with a cold. I remember crying that night. Curled up on the couch with hot cider. Still wearing the necklace. I remember taking it off and putting it in the little velvet box on my dresser. That box was gone now. I'd looked weeks ago. Assumed I'd misplaced it during the move. But here it was, in her purse. No explanation, no permission. That night, I wrote Henry a letter. Just a page, nothing fancy. "I miss you. I'm trying not to see ghosts, but she's no ghost. She's real, and she has your necklace." I folded it into my recipe book, tucked it between sour cream pound cake and molasses crinkles. Some truths need time to rise. 2 days later, I returned. Peter had called. He needed help fixing the front curtain rods. "Janelle can't reach," he said. "And I'm working late." So I came, with my old toolbox. With cinnamon bread wrapped in foil. Janelle was polite. "Distracted. Upstairs," she said, motioning with a manicured hand. "I think one of the rods is cracked." I went up. Their bedroom smelled like lavender and static. White walls, grage curtains cold. I fixed the rod, then paused, one drawer half open. A velvet pouch inside, fingers trembling, I lifted it. The same pouch, from my dresser. I opened it, and there it was, the necklace, nestled like a sleeping lie. But not just that. Beside it sat a cufflink, brass etched, Henry's initials. My knees buckled. I caught the edge of the dresser. My reflection in the mirror looked back at me. Worn, steady, not broken. Not yet. I closed the drawer, smoothed the runner on the dresser, and whispered, "Not yet, dear, but soon." Rick hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same truck, same clunky boots, same peppermint gum and Elvis on his tongue. After Henry passed, he became the one who came when the roof leaked or the faucet whined. Not because I asked, he just showed up. Like grief had its own service line. Like old friends couldn't bear silence, either. He never stayed long. Never lingered. Until last winter. That was when Janelle started showing up unexpectedly. It began with a pie dish. I was in the kitchen, flour up to my wrists, rolling dough for apple galette. Rick had come to check the furnace. He was kneeling, tools spread out, whistling, blue suede shoes. Then the door creaked. Janelle blinked, stepping in. Didn't know anyone else was here. She wore her gym leggings, face flushed, hair in a high knot, no makeup, her authentic look. She held out a glass pie dish. "I thought I'd return this," She smiled. It wasn't mine, but I wiped my hands and nodded. Of course, dear. She didn't leave. She leaned against the fridge, chatting about prenatal yoga and how Peter's been distant lately. The Rick stayed under the furnace, fiddling too long with a bolt that didn't need tightening. When he finally emerged, his eyes flicked to her stomach. Just a second. Too fast to call out. Too long to ignore. That night, I couldn't stop replaying it. The way her voice changed when Rick asked, "Do you need help carrying that back to your car?" Lower. Softer. Performative. "No, but you're sweet." Sweet. There it was again. That word. Weeks passed, and I watched more carefully. Rick stopped knocking when he arrived. Just walked around the side yard, tools in hand. Sometimes, he'd chat with Janelle while Peter was gone. Sometimes, she was already outside, watering the garden. Though it was November. One Saturday, I stopped by to deliver a pecan loaf. Peter was gone. Janelle answered in a silk robe. "He's getting a haircut," she said, holding the door but not inviting me in. Rick's truck was parked 2 houses down. I recognized the dent in the bumper. "You've got company?" I asked, too soft to sting. She laughed. "Oh no, just working on a presentation." I smiled. Left the loaf. Walked around the block. Watched from behind the hedges. Rick stepped out 20 minutes later, adjusting his collar. No tools in sight. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table. Turned on the lamp. Henry rewired himself. Opened my planner. Wrote 2 names. Smo's Janelle coffee mug. Was Rick toothbrush. I wasn't sure yet, but I needed to be. There's a moment when suspicion stops being doubt and becomes duty. Mine came when I found the cufflink and the necklace. This wasn't just about Henry anymore. It was about Peter. About what he was sacrificing for a lie. Rick came by the next Tuesday. "Furnace filter," he said, lifting the box. "Changing it out for winter." I brewed coffee. Black for him. Chamomile for me. Left the mug side by side on the counter. He sipped his without question. I let him finish. Then rinsed it. Held the rim with a paper towel. Slipped it into a plastic sandwich bag. Labeled it. Sep Janelle Mugvi Wanatra. Later that week, I stopped by Rick's garage with lemon bars. He always loved citrus. He wiped his hands on a rag, smiling like always. "Still the best baker in Traverse," he winked. I asked to use the restroom. Inside, everything smelled like sawdust and aftershave, sparse, clean. Tools hung in perfect order. On the sink sat his toothbrush, green handle worn. I pocketed it, replaced it with a new one from my purse. Old trick from Henry's hospital days. Always keep extras. Back home, I sealed the toothbrush in a bag. Labeled it in blue ink, with Rick toothbrush, dated it. Slipped it into the back of my kitchen drawer, behind the expired coupons. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, snow drifted over the garden. I sat there, staring at that drawer. The same one Henry built when he did the cabinetry after retirement. The same drawer Peter used to sneak cookies from. Now it held secrets, and I wasn't sure who they would hurt more. I opened my laptop. Searched private DNA testing Traverse City. I found a clinic 2 towns over. Discreet. Expedited results. I didn't need drama. I needed truth. Because something about the way Rick looked at her, the way she walked into my home like she owned even the air, told me that I wasn't imagining it. And if I was, well, better to be wrong with proof than right and silent. The next morning, I packed the bags in a padded envelope. Left before sunrise, told no one. The woman at the clinic was polite, no questions asked. Took my samples, took my payment. Promised results in 10 days. 10 days. 10 days of pretending, of baking, of smiling through Peter's weekly calls. Work's crazy. Janelle's been tired a lot. She's nesting now. Moving furniture at 10 p.m., I hummed. Said, "That's normal." He laughed. "You'd know, right?"
Yes.
Yes, I would. When I got home, I poured myself tea. Wrote down the tracking number. Filed it behind a photo of Peter at age 5. Chocolate on his cheeks, apron too big. Then, I pulled open the kitchen drawer again. Tucked the final bag in the back. Rick toothbrush, sealed, dated, marked. And I whispered to the drawer, like it could listen. "We're not done yet." The envelope sat on my table for 3 hours before I opened it. Not because I was afraid, but because I already knew, and knowing hurts in a different way than discovering. I watched the sunlight move across the tablecloth. I cleaned the sink. Twice. Refolded the dish towel Henry used to insist was just fine, Bess. Lit a candle. Blew it out. Lit it again. Even made a cup of chamomile. Let it steep too long. Then, finally, when the clock hit 16:10 and the shadows reached the far corner, I sat down. It was a plain envelope, white unassuming, my name typed. No return address. I turned on the lamp. Henry rewired himself that spring he finally retired. The one with the soft amber shade. Opened the drawer. Pulled out the butter knife with the oak handle. Slid it under the seal like slicing a memory open. 3 pages inside. I didn't breathe. Didn't blink. The first page read, Cis Paternity Results Summary. I read down the chart. I sample A. Janelle Holloway. Seek sample B. Peter Holloway. A excluded. 0% probability of paternity. I stared at the words. I read them again and again. Peter excluded. Peter, my boy with the chocolate-streaked chin. Peter, who cried when Henry missed a baseball game and forgave him the same night. My son. Not the father. It didn't feel like a slap. It felt like a cold hand pressed into my chest. Slowly, firmly, quietly, I turned the page. A seer sample C. Richard Evans. The excluded U% probability of paternity, Rick. Not Rick either. For a long time I sat there, listening to the house, to the refrigerator hum, to the tick of the wall clock, to the silence between truths. So, not Peter, not Rick. But I hadn't submitted a third, which meant the lab hadn't even checked for a match beyond those 2. Not because there wasn't one, but because I hadn't given them the right man. And suddenly, I knew, not in my mind, but in that deep down place under the ribs, where gut and grief meet, the walks. The afternoon walks Janelle insisted helped with swelling and mental clarity. Always around 4 p.m., always after she'd say Peter had been distant. Always alone, or so I'd thought. George Maddox, 3 houses down, yellow house. Blue shutters. White gravel path. Retired, widower. Moved in last fall after losing his wife to bone cancer. Kept his yard neat. Recycled religiously. Said, Mom, like he meant it. She'd spoken to him once over the hedge. I remember because she laughed. Not the sharp, filtered laugh she gave Peter, but something lighter. Real. She'd touched his sleeve. I remember thinking, that's nice. She's trying to be neighborly. But now that memory sat different in my body. I stood. Walked to the kitchen sink. Held the results in my hand. Didn't shred them. Didn't hide them. I placed them on the windowsill, right above the rosemary plant that never quite grew. My palms were cold. I made another cup of tea. 2 sugars. Splash of milk. Sat down. Sipped once. Felt the porcelain against my lips like an anchor. What if it was George? What did that mean? Was it a moment? A mistake? Or had she planned it all along? Had she chosen Peter for stability and George for biology? Did George know? That question stuck like grit under a lid. I thought back. 2 weeks ago, I'd seen her coming back from her walk. She wore that flowy green top. The one she always said made her feel breezy. She was smiling. Not politely, but deeply. The kind of smile a woman carries when she's carrying more than a secret. George stood at the fence, paper bag in hand. They talked too long for a neighborly hello. I hadn't thought much of it. I was planting basil. But now, the scene replayed in new light. She touched his arm. He looked at her like Henry once looked at me. And it made me angry. Not at George. Not even at her, exactly, but at how blind love makes us. At how long I'd sat in silence, trying to be the pleasant mother-in-law, the good widow, the woman who doesn't accuse. Because we were raised not to stir, not to question, not to shame. But silence has a weight, and I was tired of carrying it. I rose, walked out to the porch. The breeze had cooled. Leaves scattered in swirls like forgotten promises. Across the street, George stood adjusting his hose. He looked up, met my eyes. He smiled, not in greeting, not in comfort, but in acknowledgement, a long pause. Then he nodded, like he knew. Like he expected I might figure it out, and I nodded back. Because dignity doesn't flinch. Because truth deserves a witness. And tomorrow I would find a way to test it. I never thought I'd do it again. Sneak DNA from someone I knew, let alone someone like George Maddox. But here I was, 2 weeks after the Rick results, folding a Ziploc bag into my purse like it was a prayer card. Not out of spite, out of necessity. You don't guess in silence. You verify. And I needed to know if the man 3 doors down, the man who still used a push mower and baked banana bread on Sundays, was the missing name in that lab report. He was polite, yes, respectful, always. But Janelle knew how to find softness in people. She sniffed it out like a fox in a henhouse. I waited for the right moment. That Thursday, I baked pumpkin bread, just like I used to make for Henry in October, when the air smelled like cinnamon and firewood. I wrapped the loaf in parchment, tied it with twine, and walked over like any good neighbor might. George answered the door in his slippers, glasses perched low. "Bessie," he smiled. "Well, this is a surprise." "Thought you might need something sweet," I said. He stepped aside, motioned in. "Coffee's fresh. You've got timing." I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, because guilt doesn't belong to the wronged. His kitchen was simple. Copper kettle, wooden bar stools, a photograph of his late wife near the window. "I still can't get the scones right." He chuckled, pouring 2 mugs. "They're just flour and hope," I said. "The rest is patience." We talked about fall, about how maple leaves drop early this year, about how my rosemary's finally dying, and isn't that a metaphor? He laughed, deep, honest. I didn't press, didn't shift in my seat. I waited, and then he reached for a napkin, wiped his upper lip, left it on the table. That was enough. Minutes later, when he stepped into the garage for firewood, I folded the napkin gently, slipped it into my purse. Didn't even crease it. When I got home, I sealed it in a fresh bag, labeled it George Napkin, Octoivre, slid it behind the flour tin. The next morning, I drove to the same clinic. Didn't call ahead. Didn't wait. The nurse recognized me, polite, professional. I handed her the sample, paid in cash. No one asked why. No one needed to. She said, 10 business days. Oh, but I knew from last time, it'd come in 7. And 7 days later, it did. Same white envelope. Same cold clarity. I didn't delay this time. Opened it standing by the window, morning light across my hands. Page 1 ter sample A Janelle Holloway's Porce, sample B George Maddox. The 99.7% probability of paternity. I read it once, then lowered it, set it on the counter, sat down. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I let the tea kettle whistle. Let the birds outside fight over crusts. Let the world stay exactly the same, except me. Because now I knew. Peter had been betrayed. Rick had been misjudged. George had been used. And I had been quiet long enough. I poured tea. Strong black, no sugar. Held the cup like a gavel. She played us all. Janelle wasn't careless. She was calculated. Rick had been a decoy. Easy to suspect, hard to confirm. Peter had been her safety net. George had been her wild card. Maybe she wanted stability and comfort. Maybe she just wanted access. A name. A narrative. She'd built one. A perfect suburban tragedy: the young wife, the older man, the clueless husband, the grieving mother-in-law. She thought we'd never talk. She thought we'd never notice. But I had every detail now. Every truth in ink. I took the folder, sealed it again. Tucked it under the fruit bowl. Later that night, I sat by the fire and let the memories come. The way George had looked at her. The way she said, "Your husband's," spiritually. The way she toasted that baby shower, chin up like a queen. She'd been toying with me, testing me. And I had passed, because the worst kind of war isn't fought in shouting. It's won in silence. In preparation. In knowing. I wrote a note. Just one line. X. I know who the father is. I know it all. See, I didn't sign it. I didn't send it. I tucked it into my pocket, walked to the lake. Watched the water shiver under the wind. There was no satisfaction in being right. Only direction. I wasn't going to ruin her. I was going to remove her. And that made all the difference. Back inside, I opened my old recipe book, tore out a blank page, wrote, plan, at the top. Then I reached for the envelope. The one with George's name. Held it still for a moment. My hand didn't shake this time. Then I laid it flat on the table. I didn't tell Peter, not yet. There's a weight to truth, and if you drop it too soon, it crushes. Instead, I moved like mist, soft, slow, covering ground. The envelope stayed in the drawer beneath the piers. The plan page grew a second line. Call Monica, ask for referrals lawyer. Monica Perkins had been my friend since 1986. She married an IRS auditor, raised 2 boys, buried a mother who drank too much. She'd seen things. I trusted her. That Monday, I called. Bessie, she said, you never call on a Monday. What's wrong? Nothing yet, I answered. That's what I'm trying to keep it. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. By Friday, I had a name, Camille Rowe. Discreet. Direct. Family law, estate protection. I booked a consultation. No one knew. Not even my shadow. Meanwhile, I began tidying things, quietly. I logged into Peter's old college fund account, the one Henry and I started when he was 8. Still had our names on it. Still held just under $42,000. I changed the password. Next, I went through the joint savings Peter asked me to help him open for future family needs. The Janelle's name was never on it, but I had access. I froze it. Then, I drove to the bank. Asked for new checks. Put my maiden name on them. One small change at a time. Nothing rash. Nothing loud. Just the steady unraveling of her safety net. At home, I cleaned closets. Janelle had left a stack of maternity items in our guest room. Branded leggings, supplements, 3 copies of the same parenting book. I boxed them. Labeled, return if requested, stored them in the attic. She wouldn't ask. She'd be too proud. But I needed the room for breathing. Peter called Thursday night. Said they were planning a nursery. Asked if I still had the old rocking chair. I do, I said. He paused. Think it'd be okay if we sanded it down. Paint it white to match. That chair had soothed him through croup, growing pains, heartbreak at 17. Of course, I said. Because motherhood means saying yes to pain and calling it love. That night I wrote a new line in the plan. Rocking chair wait. I started taking walks again. Long ones, past the school, through the grocery lot, under the old elms. My knees protested, but my mind needed motion. Janelle noticed. Out for a stroll again. She said one afternoon, spotting me from her porch. Her tone was light, but her fingers curled tight around her mug. I find the air clears things, I answered. Especially in fall. She tilted her head. You okay? I smiled. Of course, dear. Just trying not to stiffen up. That evening, she brought over soup. Tomato basil. Homemade, she claimed. Thought you might need something warm. I accepted it. Tasted like salt and strategy. The next morning, I found her checking the mailbox earlier than usual. Her phone was in her hand, screen still lit. From the kitchen, I watched her pace twice between the box and the curb before walking back inside. She was waiting for something. Or maybe watching for someone. I updated my page. Mailbox. Sensitive. I started baking again, but selectively. No more Friday loaves for Peter. No more lemon bars for Janelle's coworkers. I made things for myself. For neighbors. For the librarian who once returned my late fee in tears. Healing is an act of reclaiming. And that included my kitchen. Inside, I kept a folder. Printed screenshots, Venmo transactions, timestamps. Photos Janelle at George's yard, Janelle's hand on his elbow, a shadow of intimacy beneath suburban decorum. I wasn't gathering ammo. I was building a ledger. For Camille. For Peter. For legacy. Because what good is a house full of family photos if every smile is rooted in a lie? One night, while folding laundry, I found a note in the pocket of Peter's jeans. A shopping list. But at the bottom, in Janelle's handwriting, were the words, "Ask your mom about the bakery fund." My heart didn't stop. It steadied. Because I remembered, Henry and I had once planned to reopen Sharpe's Breads as a part-time venture after retirement. We saved for it. 28,000 in a side account. I'd left it untouched for years, until now. I logged in, still whole. I moved it to a trust, only my name, only my terms. Then I wrote another line, bakery fund secured. 1 week later, I met Camille. Her office smelled like cedar and printer ink. She shook my hand firmly. "Tell me what you're protecting," she said. I handed her the folder. She flipped through pages with surgeon focus. When she looked up, her voice was measured. We can act fast, if needed. Do you want to confront or cut quietly? I exhaled. First full breath in days. Quietly, I said, but thoroughly. Camille nodded. Then we'll build a paper wall. She outlined steps: freeze assets, protect estate, limit access, notify Peter only when safe. When I left, my boots felt heavier, but my spine felt straighter. Outside, the wind bit. I pulled my coat tighter. As I walked to my car, my phone rang. Janelle. I let it ring, then I watched it stop. Inside the glove box, I had a manila envelope with George's results. Another copy. I'd bring it to Camille next time. At home, I boiled tea, chamomile and honey, stared at the fire for a long while. Then I picked up the phone. Dialed. A voice answered. Row Law. This is Bessie Sharpe, I said. I'd like to confirm my next appointment. The Sunday evening light felt older than usual. It streamed through the dining room windows like memory, soft, golden, touched with dust. I stood in the kitchen smoothing the linen napkins Walter and I had picked out for our 20th anniversary. They were a bit yellowed now, fraying slightly at the edges, but still elegant. I folded each one into perfect fans, pressing with the back of a warm spoon. Walter used to joke I ironed emotions into fabric. Tonight, I needed that quiet control. The roast chicken filled the air with rosemary and lemon. I'd chosen the same recipe I used the night Peter got accepted to Purdue. I remembered his teenage face lighting up with pride, his appetite endless, his cheeks flushed from excitement. That boy, my boy, was still in there somewhere, buried under work emails, bills, and a woman who had carefully chipped away at everything he used to be. I wasn't trying to get him back. I was trying to give him clarity, even if it broke him first. I heard tires on gravel, a car door, footsteps on the porch. I smoothed my apron once, then again, then peeled it off and hung it. My palms were dry, my heartbeat slow. I had spent every ounce of panic in the past week. The front door opened with a familiar creak. Mom, Peter called. Smells amazing. In here, sweetheart, I said, arranging the silverware one last time. The table shimmered under the light. Crystal water glasses, my grandmother's china. The wedding silver I hadn't touched in years. Peter kissed my cheek and held up a bottle of Merlot. She insisted we bring something fancy. Janelle followed behind him in a pale pink dress that clung to her figure, her belly barely showing. She looked glowing, polished, almost angelic, but her eyes sharp, watchful, testing. Evelyn, she said, leaning in with a porcelain smile, you really do outdo yourself. Only for family, I said. My voice came out like velvet over stone. Dinner moved slowly at first. Peter talked about a new mechanical client out in Ludington, something about engine vibration problems and consulting. Janelle played the part perfectly, nodding, asking thoughtful questions, brushing crumbs from her lap with delicate fingers. I listened, I smiled. But I didn't taste a single bite of food. Every clang of a fork was a countdown. Every tick of the wall clock behind me a drumbeat toward what had to be done. Halfway through the meal, Janelle leaned back in her chair, fork poised. These potatoes, she said lightly. I swear you do something magical. I tried your recipe last week, but it wasn't the same. It's the hands, I said. They remember who they're cooking for. A flicker passed over her face. She knew I wasn't talking about Peter. Peter laughed. She always says that. I mean it, I said, folding my napkin slowly. Cooking's about intention. There was a silence, a heavy one. Even Peter seemed to notice. Mom, he said. You okay? I looked at him, really looked. He had Walter's eyebrows. My father's jawline. Eyes that once held such fire and now held only the soft, dim glow of someone trying not to look too hard at his own life. I'm fine, I said. But I wasn't, and I hadn't been for months. After dessert, apple cobbler, vanilla ice cream melting into golden crust, I stood. My legs felt rooted but light at the same time. I picked up a cream envelope from the sideboard. No one noticed until I walked back to the table. I have something, I said, placing the envelope between the cobbler and the wine. before we finish the night. Peter blinked. A surprise. Of sorts. Janelle's hand hovered mid-air, her nails gleamed. She smiled, but her body went still. I didn't sit. I stayed standing, like I was reading a eulogy. I've been thinking about what it means to be a mother, I said. To carry someone in your body. Or in your heart. And what it means to love them enough to tell the truth, even if it hurts. Peter's brow furrowed. Mum, I'm speaking, I said gently, not sharply. Just a moment more. The air thinned. The candles danced. I found something last week, I continued. In the guest bathroom, folded behind the radiator, Janelle shifted. A slow exhale. It was a DNA report for the baby. Silence. Even the wind outside stilled. Peter's eyes darted from my face to hers. I wasn't looking for it, I said, but it found me anyway. I looked at Janelle. Her smile was gone now. She was calculating, measuring, wondering what I had read, what I would say next, what I wouldn't. I thought about hiding it. I continued. Burning it. Pretending. But that's not love. And it's not motherhood. I pushed the envelope forward. Peter stared at it. What is this? Janelle whispered. Don't. But he'd already picked it up. His fingers trembled. It's not mine, he said before even opening it, his voice dry. Right? He wasn't asking. He already knew. Janelle opened her mouth, then closed it. Peter slid the paper from the envelope. Read, silent. When he looked up, his face was pale as it had been when Walter died. Maybe paler. Marcus, he said. I nodded once. Janelle stood abruptly. This is cruel, she snapped. You don't know what we've been through. You don't know the pressure I've been under. Peter's voice cracked. Did you lie to me about everything? No, she whispered. Just some things. I stepped back. My job here was done. The truth had air now. It would breathe on its own. Janelle's voice turned sharp. You were never supposed to find it. But I did, I said. And now we begin again, from honesty. She glared at me, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Not fury. Not arrogance. Fear. Peter didn't say a word. He held the paper like it burned. We stood like that, the three of us, around a table that once held memories, and now proof of how far love could bend before it finally broke. The silence was thick. Janelle stared at the envelope like it had fangs. Peter looked between us, eyes wide, frozen mid-reach for his glass. Mom? He said slowly. What is this? I didn't sit down. My voice came steady. It's a paternity test. I had it done last week, using a hairbrush from the guest room, and your old coffee mug. Janelle. Her mouth parted, but no sound came. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. Peter blinked. Why would you? I looked at him then. My son. The one I'd raised through chicken pox and scraped knees and awkward high school dances. The one who trusted too easily. The one who called me every Tuesday for advice on making pot roast, even though Janelle hated beef. I needed to be sure, I said. Sure of what? I took a breath. That you weren't raising someone else's child. Without knowing. Peter sat back, eyes scanning the envelope. You think I'm not the father? Nope. I looked directly at Janelle. I know you're not. She stood, suddenly. Her chair scraped against the tile. You had no right? She snapped. That was private. You whispered in my ear that the baby was my husband's. I said, low. You forfeited privacy the moment you made that threat. Peter turned to her pale. You said that? She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, slowly, turned it into a shrug. It was a joke. I was emotional. Hormones. No, I said. You wanted to hurt me, but you didn't expect me to check. And you really didn't expect I'd find out what I did. Peter's voice cracked. Who is it then? Rick? Janelle's nostrils flared. It doesn't matter.
It does to me.
I stepped closer. Calm but firm. It's not Rick either. That got her. Janelle's eyes darted toward the window. Just a flicker, but enough. Enough to confirm the final piece. George, I said. The name fell like stone. Our new neighbor. Peter echoed. I nodded. The one she sees every afternoon when she goes for a walk to clear her head. The one who just lost his wife. The one who asked if he could help me move flower pots last month. She's been helping him cope. Peter sat down hard, like someone had kicked his legs out. Jesus, he whispered. You're telling me this entire time she's been. Janelle folded her arms. I wasn't planning any of this, okay? I didn't mean for it to happen. It's not like you were even around. Always working, always stressed. So you decided to lie to me, to Mom, to protect myself, she barked. I was scared. I didn't know what George wanted. I didn't know what you'd do. I didn't know. You didn't care, I said quietly. And that was the truth, wasn't it? Peter stared at the floor. His hands trembled on his knees. Janelle's voice softened. Petey, it's still early. We can talk. Maybe we work through this, go to therapy, figure something out. Figure what out? He said, flat. How I'm supposed to raise a child you conceived while lying to my mother's face. She looked at him, eyes pleading. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But it did. We stood there in the kitchen. Me with my hands still dusted from dessert, Peter with his whole life cracked open in front of him, and Janelle in her designer flats, no longer glowing. I think you should leave, Peter said, finally. What? Her voice snapped back to sharp. Tonight, I'll stay at a hotel, but I want you out of Mom's house. Out of her life. You made this mess. I can't fix it. Not right now. She turned to me. You'd let him throw me out. I tilted my head. You threatened me. Lied to my son. Made a game out of a baby's future. You were never really in. She scoffed, grabbed her purse, and stormed toward the door. I hope you enjoy your cobbler, Evelyn. Thank you, I said. It was made with patience. The door slammed. Peter sank into the chair again, burying his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, Mom, he murmured. God, I was so blind. I sat beside him, laid a hand on his shoulder. No, you were kind and hopeful. That's not a fault. He wiped his face. What do I do now? You start again, I said. You heal. You learn. You show your child what honesty looks like, even if they never know your name. He looked at me. You still want to be in the baby's life. I paused. Then, that baby didn't ask for this, and if someday they need someone steady, someone who makes cobbler and folds napkins slow, I'll be here. Peter wept then. Not loud, just tears that came steady, like rain that had been building for months, and I let them come. We cleaned the kitchen together in silence. Dishes washed, floor swept, the envelope tucked back into the drawer alongside old photos and clipped recipes. That night, after Peter left for a friend's place, I sat alone in the kitchen. Same table, same lavender breeze. But this time, no lies lingered in the air. Only quiet, only truth, and maybe, just maybe peace. The house was quiet again. Janelle had left 2 weeks ago. The guest room was stripped bare of her lotions and scarves. Her lavender perfume no longer lingered in the hallway. The air had changed. It was lighter now, like a storm had passed and the windows had finally been opened. Peter hadn't said much in those first days. He walked like he was underwater. Ate because I put food in front of him. He sat with his head in his hands, silent, for hours. But he never blamed me for what I did. One morning, I found him in the garage. He was going through the boxes he and Janelle had packed together when they first moved in. I watched from the door as he tore the masking tape off one of them, then paused to study a photo, his wedding day. Janelle in her white dress, radiant, false. Peter, hopeful. My throat closed. He stared at it for a long time before setting it aside. He never said a word. He didn't need to. I just walked over and touched his shoulder. He reached for my hand and held it like he was afraid to let go. That was the beginning of the healing. Peter started therapy the following week. He joined a local support group for single fathers and even began attending financial counseling. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone at night, talking with other members. Once, I caught him laughing. Not just a polite chuckle, but a deep, surprised laugh. It startled us both. As for me, I found myself drawn back to my old rhythms. I reopened the side porch where my bakery used to be. Just for fun at first. Banana bread for the neighbors, cinnamon rolls on Saturdays. But word spread. The kids down the street started showing up with flour on their cheeks and questions in their eyes. "Miss Evelyn, can we help?" I let them. I taught them how to knead dough, how to tell when a pie crust was ready, how to whistle while waiting for the timer to ding. The laughter that filled my kitchen wasn't forced or suspicious. It was light, warm, familiar. Sometimes, in the still of early evening, I'd sit on the front steps with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the lake ripple under the last of the day's sun. That's when I'd talk to Henry. Just in my head. The way I used to when he was in the garage fixing up old radios. "You'd be proud of Peter," I'd whisper, "and I think you'd be proud of me too." One Thursday, a small envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a photo of a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket, wide-eyed, nose slightly crooked like Marcus's. On the back, written in a slanted hand, "His name is David. Thank you for giving me a second chance." I didn't cry. I just placed the photo gently into the small wooden box on my dresser where I kept other small tokens of truth. That evening, Peter joined me on the porch. He brought 2 slices of lemon pound cake and sat beside me, letting the screen door thump shut behind him. He didn't say anything right away. We watched the sun sink behind the pines. Finally, he spoke. "Do you think I'll ever trust someone again?" I didn't rush to answer. I sipped my tea. Let the breeze run through my hair, listen to the frogs starting their evening chorus. "Yes," I said. "Not because you forget what happened, but because you'll know yourself better. And knowing yourself is the only way you'll spot the difference next time." He nodded, looked down at the cake in his lap. "You think I'll make a good father?" "You already are," I said. "Because you're asking that question." We sat there until the fireflies came out, until the porch light flicked on automatically, until the tea went cold. I thought about the dinner table where it all started. The chandelier light, the smirk, the whisper, the envelope, the silence that followed. Justice didn't come loudly. It never does at this age. There were no slammed doors, no social media confessions, no revenge videos gone viral. Just a woman with a paper, a truth, and a son who deserved to live free of lies. Sometimes I wonder what people imagine justice looks like at 68. A courtroom, a shouting match, a broken vase. No. Sometimes it looks like a porch swing, 2 slices of pound cake, and a breeze that carries nothing but peace. That was my ending. That was my beginning. And if you've made it this far with me, maybe you've got a truth of your own. Maybe you've held something heavy in your chest for too long. So here's my question. If someone handed you the paper, the proof, the power, what would you do with it? Would you burn it? Or would you place it gently in front of the one who needed it most? Because sometimes, the quietest gesture is the loudest kind of justice. And sometimes, healing begins with a slice of cake. And the courage to say, "I know." Peter moved back in just 2 weeks after Janelle left. He didn't say much, just stood on the porch one evening with a duffel bag and tired eyes. I opened the door before he could knock. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Supper's still warm." He nodded, and that was that. We fell into a quiet rhythm. Mornings with coffee and newspaper, evenings with leftovers and old movies. It wasn't the same as when he was a boy. But in some ways, it was better. We were 2 people trying to rebuild what we'd both let fracture. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, sifting through a worn leather folder. Spreadsheets, statements, credit notices. The full extent of what Janelle had left behind. She opened 5 cards in my name. He muttered, almost to himself, "I didn't even know about the Chase one." I sat beside him. "Let me help, Mom. It's just money." I cut in. "We've faced worse." He looked at me like he wanted to believe that. So I opened the drawer under the oven and pulled out a manila envelope. "Your dad and I bought a tiny plot near Lake Anne back in '92. Thought we might build a cabin someday." Peter blinked. You never told me. We never needed it, but now, maybe you do. We sold it the next week. It covered most of what was left. That weekend, we started renovating the kitchen. Just the two of us. Peter changed the cabinet doors. I retiled the backsplash with a Robin's egg blue I'd always loved but Cedric thought was too loud. We laughed more than we'd had in months. About grout colors. About burnt cookies, about the past. Healing, I was learning, wasn't a dramatic event. It was dish soap bubbles and shared silence. One afternoon, I got a letter from Marcus. The envelope was simple, no return address. Inside, a folded note and a photo. The note said, "Chore Mrs. Sharpe, I'm living in Ludington now. Working at the local community garden.
Chore, it's quiet.
I like it. I think about everything that happened often. Not with regret for being caught in it, but gratitude that the truth came out. Thank you for protecting the things that mattered. Torf Marcus." The photo was of a small greenhouse. In front stood Marcus, holding a little boy with curly black hair. A small sign in the background read, "David's Patch." Peter found me sitting on the porch steps later that night, the photo in my lap. "He looks happy," he said, lowering himself beside me. I nodded. "He does." We watched the lake shimmer under the fading light. A breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and something sweet from the neighbor's grill. Peter leaned back on his hands. "You know what I've been thinking about?" "What?" "I want to teach David how to fish. When he's older." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was legacy. A new one. "Then we better fix that old rod in the shed," I replied. Peter smiled. "A real one." The next morning, we packed 2 sandwiches and a loaf of zucchini bread and drove to Ludington. It had been a year, 12 full moons since that baby shower, since Janelle leaned in and whispered poison in my ear. 12 months since I poured the tea, smiled through glass, and then brought out a manila envelope that would break a lie clean in half. The house by the lake stood quieter now. Not lonely, just steadier. Peter stayed with me for a while, after the fallout. He needed the silence, the structure, the warmth of something familiar. He kept to the guest room, but left the door open. Every night, I'd hear the soft creak of floorboards as he moved around, unable to sleep, trying to piece his world back together. Some mornings, we made pancakes together. Others, we just sipped coffee and watched ducks skim across the fog. The lake had a way of absorbing pain. It didn't rush you. It just sat with you, like an old friend. Peter never asked me to talk about Janelle. He didn't need to, and I didn't bring her up unless he did. Eventually, he started leaving the house for longer stretches, volunteering with the local high school's robotics team, picking up freelance projects again. And one afternoon in spring, he came home with a small bouquet of wildflowers and a sheepish look on his face. "She teaches at the middle school," he said. "Her name's Lauren." I just smiled, quietly, and took the flowers, placing them in the old mason jar we used as a vase. Lauren came to dinner 2 weeks later. She brought lemon pie and laughed with her whole face. Not loud, but real. I watched Peter pull out her chair and thought, he's learning. She didn't ask about Janelle. Didn't ask about the baby, just passed me a second slice of pie and offered to help with dishes. Sometimes justice is loud, but sometimes it's the simple act of starting again with someone who doesn't walk in carrying lies. By midsummer, Peter and Lauren were talking about adoption. It wasn't planned. Just happened. A baby girl, abandoned at birth. Her name was Grace. And Lord, if that wasn't the most perfect name I'd heard in a long time. I knit her a blanket from leftover yarn. The same shade of soft cream I'd once used to make a sweater for Peter. This time, it felt like a full circle, not a repetition. We had a photo of her in the hallway now. Tiny hands, big eyes, a little curl of hair like Peter had as a baby. One afternoon while folding laundry, I caught myself humming. No reason, no music on. Just peace. That was when I knew the healing had taken root. I kept the DNA test. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because truth, once found, deserves to be remembered. And I wrote a letter. Not to Janelle. She hadn't returned since the night she packed her bags. I heard she moved back east. No address. No goodbye. That chapter was over. But the baby David, he would grow up with questions. And someday, I thought, maybe he'd want to know. Not the gory details. Not the drama. Just the truth, told gently, so I wrote it out by hand. In my careful script. The same way I used to write recipes for my bakery customers back when sugar was 49 cents a pound. Dear David, it began. You don't know me. But I was there when the world tried to lie to you. I didn't accuse. I didn't name names or paint villains. Just offered clarity, wrapped in kindness. And love, from someone who'd loved his father once, before any of this ever happened. I signed it simply. Bessie Sharpe, 109 Lakeside Way, and I placed it in an envelope marked, for when he's ready. I don't know when that day will come. Maybe never, but I'd rather leave the truth waiting than a silence filled with questions. That evening, I brewed a pot of Earl Grey. The good kind, with bergamot so strong it tingled behind your nose. I carried my cup to the porch. The lake was glass, still and wide and full of memory. Behind me, I heard laughter through the kitchen window. Peter Lauren. Little Grace squealing as she tried her first mashed peas. It didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like healing, and I let it hold me. I sipped my tea, folded the letter once more, watched the sky turn the color of ripe plums. No fireworks, no final judgment. Just the quiet dignity of knowing I hadn't screamed. I hadn't begged. I hadn't let anyone write the ending for me. And in the end, that was justice enough. If you're still here, thank you. This wasn't a tale of drama or shouting matches. It was about quiet strength, a woman who chose clarity over chaos, dignity over revenge. Evelyn didn't need to scream to be heard. She held the truth in her hands and let it speak for itself. And in doing so, she protected her son, reclaimed her peace, and reminded us all. Sometimes, the most powerful justice is the one that doesn't raise its voice. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in Evelyn's shoes? Have you ever stayed silent to hold your family together, even when your heart was breaking? Share your story in the comments. Every voice matters here. Every lived experience helps someone feel a little less alone. And if this story made you feel seen, subscribe to Unraveling, because your story could be next.